Thunder split the Texas sky, a warning Elias Ward ignored. The rain stung his face as he rode through the plains, the mesquite trees clawing at the storm. The wind howled, dragging with it the scent of wet cedar and the bitter promise of regret. Elias was a man broken by loss. His wife Mary lost to a fever that had torn through their shack in the middle of nowhere. His unborn child had never taken its first breath. Now he was a hired gun, nothing more than an instrument of death, sent by Silas Granger to kill a woman and her son. Ahead, through the rain, the soft flicker of smoke rose into the sky. Clara. Boone's homestead. The cabin sat lonely against the storm, with a sagging porch and a patched chicken coop. It was nothing special, but hers, and it was all she had. Elias's horse trudged forward, its hooves splashing through the muck, and the light from the homestead drew him closer. The job was clear. Kill them both. The land was valuable, and Silas would pay him well. But as Elias neared the homestead, something stopped him. Through the rain he saw the boy, a small 10-year-old figure in the storm, hammering away at a fence post, too small for the task yet determined. His eyes, wide and fearless, met Elias's from across the distance. Something stirred deep within him, a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, something he couldn't name. The boy's innocence and his quiet defiance against the storm reminded Elias of what he had lost. Elias gripped his rifle tighter, but the hesitation crept in. Why couldn't he pull the trigger? His finger hovered over the cold metal of the trigger, but the doubt gnawed at him. This wasn't just a job anymore, this was something else. What happened next will shock you. Elias tethered his horse to a weathered mesquite tree near a limestone ridge and gazed across the rain-soaked plains at the homestead ahead. It was a modest place, nothing grand. It was a log cabin with a sagging porch, the kind that looked as though it had withstood years of wear, and a chicken coop patched together with wire. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, rising against the stormy sky, a small beacon in the vast expanse of the Texas wilderness. The wind carried the smell of wet cedar, mingling with the scent of rain-soaked earth. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its mournful cry swallowed by the storm. Elias squinted through the rain, his coat soaked through, and with each step he took toward the homestead, a tightness pulled at his chest. The job was simple. Silas's money was good, and all he had to do was kill Clara Boone and her boy. But as the cabin grew nearer, doubt gnawed at him, and he pushed the feeling down. The door to the cabin creaked open, and out stepped Clara Boone, a woman in her early 30s, her face drawn but strong. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to survival. She carried a bucket of water, her expression wary, but her eyes never left Elias as he approached. His boots crunched against the muddy ground, the sound of his arrival unmistakable. "Caught in the storm," he said, his voice rough from the journey. Clara didn't say anything immediately, only studying him briefly, as though weighing his words. Then she nodded curtly. "You can stay in the barn, ain't much, but it'll keep you dry." Her tone was flat, guarded. Levi, her son, was a few paces behind her, bent over a broken fence post, his small hands gripping a hammer far too large for his frame. He glanced up, his face brightening when he saw Elias. "You got a horse?" he asked eagerly, his voice filled with the kind of curiosity that could soften a heart made of stone. Elias nodded slowly, offering a tight smile. "I do," he replied, his eyes lingering on the boy for a moment longer than he intended. Something about the way Levi spoke, innocent, unguarded, struck a chord deep within him. It reminded Elias of the child he had lost, the one who would never be born, and it stirred something dark and tender in his chest. Clara, watching them, narrowed her eyes but said nothing. She didn't trust him. Elias could feel it. But then again, he hadn't expected to be trusted. The world had taught him long ago not to trust anyone, and he had long since learned to return the favor. "Get inside," Clara said to Levi, nodding toward the door. He reluctantly dropped his hammer, wiping his hands on his shirt before heading inside, but not before giving Elias another curious look. Elias followed the boy's gaze momentarily before returning to the fence. He hesitated, then moved forward, his boots squelching in the mud. At best, Levi's work on the fence was rudimentary, but it was honest. Elias's calloused hands instinctively reached for a broken board, lifting it and pulling a new one into place. There was a comfort in the work, something familiar about it. It reminded him of the days when his hands had built things instead of destroying them. For a moment, there was silence, save for the sound of the storm raging around them, the crack of the wood and the creaking of the cabin in the wind. Elias's heart thudded in his chest as he worked alongside Levi, the boy's small voice occasionally filling the silence with innocent questions about the horse and the journey. "Where's your mama?" Elias asked as he tightened a nail into the wood, trying to distract himself from the pain beneath the surface. Levi paused for a moment, glancing up. "She's inside, I reckon. She's always inside when it rains. Fixing something or cooking." His voice held the simplicity of a child, yet there was a depth in his eyes that Elias couldn't ignore. The pang inside Elias grew stronger. This boy was full of life and hope, and Elias had been sent to take that from him. "Seems like you got a good grip on that hammer," Elias remarked, trying to shift the conversation, but his voice betrayed him. It came out soft, almost like a question. Levi grinned, a toothy smile that looked too big for his face. "I'm better at it than Mama," he said proudly. "She says I'll fix up the whole ranch one day." Elias managed a small, tight smile, a part of him wanting to laugh. The boy's confidence was endearing, and Elias felt a strange connection at that moment. This wasn't just some job for money. This was a life he was about to destroy. And yet every time he looked at Levi, the boy's hopeful eyes made him question everything. The air around them seemed to be still for a moment, and Elias realized he was standing too close to the boy, watching him too intently. He took a step back, forcing himself to focus on the work at hand, the task that had brought him here. His hand brushed against his rifle, its weight a constant reminder of his mission. He wasn't here to make friends, yet every moment spent with Levi and Clara pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain. He was a man who had once killed without question, driven by grief and rage. But this boy, this innocent child, was somehow shifting his resolve. The rain fell harder. The wind picked up, and Elias silently finished his task. He knew he had to leave soon to do what he had come for, but the weight of the rifle felt heavier now, its promise of death far more complicated than it had seemed when he had first accepted the job. He stepped back and wiped his hands on his coat, eyes shifting toward the homestead. Clara was watching. From the doorway, her gaze steady and unreadable. She hadn't said much, but he could feel her suspicion. She was used to danger, men like him who showed up at her door without warning. As Elias turned away from the fence, the wind carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant howl of a coyote, he couldn't help but wonder, what was it about this boy that made him question everything? Have you ever met someone who changed your path forever? Share your story in the comments. Elias woke early the next morning, the grey light of dawn creeping over the plains. He had barely slept, his mind churning with the thought of the boy and the woman who now inhabited his thoughts. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy silence. The air smelled fresh, the land washed clean by rain. But Elias couldn't shake the weight pressing on him, the one that had followed him for years. The previous day's work felt like a lifetime ago. He had helped repair the homestead, chopping wood and fixing a leak in the roof. But as he stood at the edge of the porch that morning, he couldn't ignore the memories that had surfaced, memories that gnawed at him every time he closed his eyes. He had been young once, full of hope before the world stripped that away. The house he had shared with Mary hadn't been much, just a dusty shack on the edge of a small town, but it had been theirs. They had dreams, a future. He could still remember how she had looked at him with that glint of hope in her eyes, and how her laughter would fill the empty spaces in their small home. But that was before the fever had come, quick and relentless. It stole Mary away, just like that. Her body weakened over days, and he watched helplessly as the woman he had loved slipped away. He had tried everything, doctors, herbs, prayers, but ultimately it had been her time. And their unborn child, the little life that had never even breathed in this world, was lost too. The pain from that day never truly left him. After their deaths, Elias had turned to mercenary work to survive. Each job, each coin he earned, only reminded him of his failure. He had spent years chasing money, trying to bury the guilt, trying to make up for a life he had never even been given the chance to live. But it wasn't the life he had chosen that had shattered him. It was the fact that he had decided it, after losing everything that had mattered. And now, here he was, about to end another life in the name of money. Elias snapped out of the memories when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Clara standing with her arms crossed over her chest, her brow furrowed. Her eyes softened just a fraction, but her gaze still had a wariness. She was becoming more comfortable with him, but trust was not easily earned in a world like theirs. "I could use some help," she said, nodding toward the barn. "The roof's leaking again, if you don't mind." Elias gave a curt nod and followed her, silently taking in the surroundings. The homestead was modest, but had a kind of quiet strength to it. It was weathered just like him, but it had survived. They had survived. Inside the barn, Clara handed him a bucket and a few nails. They worked silently for a time, the only sound of the hammer's rhythmic strikes against the wood. The work was simple enough, but Elias felt the weight of it all, how much this place meant to her, how much it had cost her to keep it going. "Why'd you leave?" Clara asked suddenly, her voice low as she looked up from her work. "Where did you come from?" The question hit him like a cold wind. For a moment Elias couldn't speak. He had never been good at sharing his past. The walls he had built around it were thick, and he preferred to keep them that way. "I've been around," he said after a beat, his voice hoarse, betraying him. He glanced up at her, trying to mask the weight of the words he didn't want to say. "Had to find work." Clara studied him for a long moment, but her expression remained unreadable. She didn't push, but Elias could feel the curiosity burning behind her gaze. She was too sharp, too observant to buy his flimsy answer. As the day wore on, Levi came. Bounding out of the cabin with a small wooden carving, he held it out to Elias, his eyes wide with pride. "Look what I made," he said eagerly. It was a simple carving, a horse, but the detail was impressive for someone so young. Elias took it in his hands, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. A lump formed in his throat. "That's a fine horse," he said, his voice thick with something he couldn't place. Levi beamed. "Mama says I'll be a good rancher one day." Elias swallowed hard, the words hitting him deeper than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the innocence of a child's dreams, the way they saw the world in terms of possibilities rather than regrets. "Your mama's right," Elias said quietly, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. The truth of it, that the boy's simple faith in a better future was something he had long since lost, cut through him like a knife. Clara had come outside, no doubt hearing the exchange, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood at the edge of the porch, her eyes fixed on the two of them. Something in her gaze shifted, but Elias couldn't quite place it. That night, after the work was done and the day faded into dusk, Elias sat in the barn, staring at the empty fields. His thoughts churned like the storm clouds that had passed through earlier. The campfire's flicker cast long shadows on the walls, and the distant rumble of thunder reminded him that the storm was far from over. Clara's words from earlier lingered in the air. "Why'd you leave?" He couldn't answer. Not yet. The truth of who he was, of what he had done, was still locked behind a door that even he was too afraid to open. That night, as Clara locked up the house and settled into her bed, she glanced at the shotgun beside the door. Her eyes lingered on it for a long moment, her fingers twitching near the handle. She had no reason to trust Elias, and something told her that the darkness behind his eyes was not so easily shaken. She didn't know what to make of him, but she wasn't sure she wanted to. How long could Elias hide the truth from a woman who saw through lies? The storm came without warning. One minute the sky was heavy with thick and grey clouds, and the heavens seemed to split open the next. Lightning streaked across the plains, illuminating the vast emptiness of Texas in harsh, jagged flashes. The wind howled like a wild animal, tearing through the mesquite trees, bending them low as if they too were bowing to the storm's fury. The rain followed with an unrelenting force, pounding the earth and turning the soil into a slick, treacherous muck. Elias, Clara, and Levi worked in a frantic, hasty effort to secure the homestead. The sound of boards being hammered into place was drowned out by the deafening roar of the wind. Elias moved purposefully, his hands steady despite the chaos, nailing shutters onto the windows. Clara, her face set with determination, fought against the gusts of wind as she tied down the chicken coop. Small but determined, Levi held onto the rope as if his life depended on it. The wind whipped his hair into his eyes, but he didn't flinch. "Keep at it, boy," Elias shouted above the wind, his voice harsh but encouraging. Levi nodded, pushing through the storm with a strength that surprised Elias. The boy was tougher than he appeared. The storm grew worse, the sky darkening, and a deep rumble of thunder reverberated through the land, sending a shudder through the cabin. Inside, the wind rattled the walls and windows, the house creaking under the pressure. The smell of wet earth and rain-drenched wood filled the air. They were trapped, and the storm was no longer a passing threat, but a violent force that had them at its mercy. As the storm trapped them inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The three of them sat near the fire, the crackling warmth doing little to ease the tension in the air. Levi, usually full of energy, was silent, his small face pale in the firelight. The wind howled outside, making the cabin feel even more isolated and fragile. A thunderclap shook the house louder than the rest, rattling the walls like they might collapse at any moment. Levi, frightened by the noise, leaped to his feet. Without thinking, he ran straight into Elias's arms, clinging to him as if Elias were the only anchor in the world. "Papa," Levi whispered, his voice trembling. He wasn't looking at Elias but at the floor, his small hands gripping his coat. For a moment, everything else in the room faded away. Elias froze. His heart, already heavy with the weight of his actions, cracked. He felt the word hit him like a physical blow, and for the briefest second he was transported back to his lost child, the one he had never held, never seen. He felt a pain, sharp and deep, as if he were being torn in two. Levi, thinking of his late father, clung to him for comfort. Elias's mind raced. The storm raged outside, but inside, it was as though time had stopped. He could feel Clara's gaze on him, sharp and unyielding. Her eyes, once wary, softened with a strange understanding, though she said nothing. The words Levi had spoken, "Papa," haunted Elias. They echoed in the silence, digging deeper into his chest. Clara finally broke the silence, her voice quiet, but filled with a sorrow that seemed to hang in the air. My husband. He was taken. By raiders. Shot down in the fields one evening. I never got to say goodbye." She paused, the pain in her voice still raw despite the years that had passed. He never got to see Levi grow up. Elias's throat tightened, the pain in Clara's words settling deep in his bones. She had lost everything, just as he had. "I'm sorry," Elias murmured, unsure if the words were enough. He wanted to say more and pour out his guilt and regret, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to confess the truth to Clara. He tried to tell her why he was here, why he had come to her home, to this boy. The money Silas had promised him, the way he had fallen into this life of violence, all of it was tangled up inside him. But now, with Levi's small hand clutching his coat, the truth seemed impossible to speak. Elias looked down at Levi, who had fallen asleep against him, his small body still trembling from the storm and the fear that had gripped him. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind picking up and the rain lashing at the windows with such force it sounded like the house might break apart. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a shift within himself. The weight of the rifle slung over his shoulder, the cold metal that had come to define him, felt wrong. He couldn't do it, not after everything that had happened in this small cabin, after Levi's trusting eyes had met his. But as he looked out the window, the faintest glint of movement caught his eye. In the distance, on the edge of the storm, silhouettes began to appear, figures riding toward the homestead, moving through the rain with purpose. His heart sank. Silas's men. They were coming. They had found him. Elias's resolve wavered for the briefest moment. Could he protect them? Could he save this family from the storm outside, and the one Silas had sent to destroy them? The storm raged, the thunder deafening, but Elias stood, steady and determined, his mind focused. He could no longer be the man he had been. The time for violence was over. Now it was a time for protection. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. But could he stop the storm? Could he save them from the men coming? For their blood. What's a moment that broke your heart but gave you hope? Tell us in the comments. The first light of dawn broke across the Texas plains, pale and cold, casting long shadows over the homestead. Elias sat at the edge of the porch, staring out at the land he had been hired to destroy. His thoughts were a tangled mess, each one worse than the last. The storm had passed, but the weight of his decision had only grown heavier. He had spent the night in turmoil, torn between the job that had brought him here and the bond he felt with the woman and child who now trusted him. Inside the cabin, Clara moved about quietly, preparing for the day. Her face was drawn, but her every movement had a quiet strength. Levi was still asleep, curled up in the cabin's warmth, unaware of the storm about to hit them. Elias knew it was time to confess, time to face the truth. He stood, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked into the cabin. Clara was standing by the hearth, her back to him, as she stirred the remnants of the fire. He hesitated momentarily, his throat tight, but he couldn't run from this. "I need to tell you something," Elias said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Clara didn't turn around, but her shoulders stiffened. She knew, she had known since the storm when Levi called him Papa. There was something in Elias's eyes, something she couldn't quite place but had felt from the beginning. He took a deep breath, knowing no way to soften the blow. "I wasn't just passing through," Elias said, his voice breaking the silence. "Silas, Granger, he hired me to kill you and Levi. For the land he promised me money, and I took it." For a long moment Clara didn't speak. The room seemed to close around them, the air thick with tension. Finally she turned to face him, her face hard, her eyes cold and sharp. "Get out," she said, her voice low, almost too calm. The shotgun she had kept by the door was now in her hands, the barrel aimed squarely at his chest. Elias felt his heart skip a beat, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. He had been a killer before, and he had faced death more times than he cared to remember. But this was different. This woman and her child, he had failed them. I didn't do it. I couldn't, Elias said, his voice thick with regret. I can't do it. I won't. Clara's hands tightened around the shotgun, her knuckles white, but she didn't pull the trigger. She was too smart for that. She knew, deep down, that Elias wasn't the same man who had come to her doorstep. But the truth of what he had been sent to do was too much. There is too much to forgive. Levi, who had woken up at their voices, stepped into the room, his small face confused. He looked between his mother and Elias, sensing the shift in the air. "What's going on?" Levi asked, his voice small, his eyes wide with fear. Clara sighed, lowering the shotgun just a fraction but not lowering her guard. "Go back to the room, Levi," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Everything's fine." Levi hesitated but nodded, and retreated to his room, his footsteps fading. Clara turned back to Elias, the hurt in her eyes more than he could bear. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that to us?" Elias couldn't answer her. What could he say? That he had taken the job out of desperation, that the money had clouded his judgment. None of it mattered now. He was here, and the pain he had caused her was real no matter what he did next. "I was lost," Elias whispered. "I didn't know who I was anymore, and when Silas came to me with that money, it felt like I could buy back some of what I'd lost." He looked at Clara, his voice desperate. "But I'm not that man anymore. I can't. I can't do it, Clara, I swear to you." Clara stood there, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to figure out if his words were true or just another lie. Finally, she lowered the shotgun, her expression softening just slightly. "I don't know what to believe," she said, her voice quiet, filled with pain. "But you're here now, and you've brought danger to my door." Elias nodded, his heart sinking as he realized the weight of his actions. He had come to destroy them, but now he wanted to protect them, and he wasn't sure if they would ever believe he could. Clara turned away, her voice steady but with a note of sorrow. "We have to prepare. Silas's men are coming. You're right about that much. I won't let them take us without a fight." Elias followed her to the door, his mind racing. Clara wasn't finished with him, and he wasn't done with her. "There's something you need to know," she said, glancing at him over her shoulder. "My husband taught me how to shoot. He wasn't the only one who carried a rifle around here. I've got skills, Elias. Don't underestimate me." Elias looked at her, both surprised and impressed. He had never imagined Clara as anything but a woman struggling to keep her home, but she was more than that, much more. She was a fighter. "Then, let's fight," Elias said, his voice steady, resolved. Just as they were about to turn to prepare for the coming fight, a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Martha Wells, a neighbor who lived a few miles away. She looked worn, her face pale and anxious. "They're coming," she said, her voice urgent. "I saw riders in the distance. I'm unsure how many, but they're heading this way." Elias's heart raced. Silas's men were here, and there was no turning back now. Clara looked at him, her expression hardening once again. "You're with us, Elias," she said, her voice cold but firm. "You'll protect us or you'll leave. There's no in-between." Elias nodded, the weight of his decision settling deep within him. He had come here to kill, but now, for the first time in years, he had something to live for. Would their trust survive the fight that was coming? The sun dipped low behind the Texas horizon, casting a blood-red glow across the plains. Shadows stretched long over the homestead, and a heavy silence settled over the land. Elias stood just outside the cabin, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning. the distance. The sky above was streaked with crimson, the dying light painting everything in hues of fire. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that came before violence. Inside, Clara checked the ammunition, her hands moving quickly, confidently. She hadn't said much since Martha's warning, but her focus was unshakable. Levi sat near the hearth, quiet, holding a box of bullets. His face was pale, but his grip was steady. The boy understood more than he let on. "They'll come from the ridge," Clara said, nodding toward the west. "It gives them cover from the creek." Elias nodded. "We hold here. You take the window. I'll cover the door." Clara didn't argue. She moved to her spot without hesitation, her rifle already loaded. The silence didn't last long. A shot rang out loud and sharp, splitting the evening air. The bullet struck the edge of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Another shot followed, then another. Elias ducked behind the porch post, returning fire. Muzzle flashes lit the dusk like lightning. Levi flinched, but didn't run. He crawled, low along the floor, pushing the box of rounds toward Clara. She took them, reloaded, and without missing a beat, aimed through the cracked window and fired. One of the attackers dropped, his scream swallowed by the gunfire. Clara's eyes stayed cold, focused. Her breathing was even. Elias had seen skilled sharpshooters in his time, but none had surprised him like this. She was calm and controlled, a fighter shaped by loss and hardened by survival. Another figure darted between trees near the coop. Elias fired and clipped the man in the shoulder, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The last gunman broke from cover, charging toward the cabin in a full sprint. Levi screamed. The man reached the porch, kicking open the door. Clara pivoted, but didn't have a clear shot. The gunman lunged toward Levi, grabbing the boy's arm. Elias moved without thinking. He dropped his rifle, crossed the room in 3 strides, and slammed into the attacker with full force. They crashed into the table, smashing it to pieces. They grappled, fists flying. The man reached for his revolver, but Elias struck first, knocking the weapon from his grasp. They rolled across the floor, crashing into the hearth. Clara stepped in, her aim deadly. One clean shot and it was over. The silence that followed was staggering. The room was thick with smoke, and dust hung in the air. Outside, the world remained still. There were no more bullets, no more shouts, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of Elias breathing heavily beside Levi, his body trembling from adrenaline and rage. Levi clung to him, his face buried against Elias's chest. The boy didn't cry, but his silence was louder than a scream. Elias held him close, his arms tight, as if letting go would break him in half. Clara lowered her rifle, stepping closer. Her eyes met Elias's, and something passed between them in that instant. Not forgiveness yet, but something real. Mutual. Understanding. Respect. The cabin was scarred. Glass shattered, bullet holes in the walls, blood on the floor, but they were alive. Elias helped Levi to his feet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice raw. Levi nodded, then looked up at him. "You didn't let him take me." Elias couldn't answer. He only touched the boy's shoulder and gave a small nod. They began to assess the damage. A window was destroyed. The west wall had taken most of the fire. The furniture was broken, but the structure held. It had taken a beating and survived. Like them. Clara moved outside, carefully stepping over the gravel littered with spent shells and blood. The smell of gunpowder lingered, sharp and metallic. She took a long breath and looked out toward the darkening ridge. The world had gone quiet again. Elias joined her, his shirt torn, knuckles bloodied. "That wasn't the end," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was something." They stood silently, the sky above deepening into a navy-blue curtain dotted with early stars. Then Clara spoke again, her tone flat but edged with fire. "I heard from Martha. Silas is spreading lies, telling folks in town you turned on the law, that you can't be trusted." Elias stared into the distance, jaw clenched. "He knows I didn't finish the job. He's trying to cut off any support I've got." Clara glanced sideways at him. "So what do we do?" Elias looked back toward the cabin, where Levi was sitting near the doorway, still holding the box of bullets like gold. "We protect what's ours." A breeze moved through the grass, whispering through the mesquite branches. It brought no comfort, only more questions. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. Could they rebuild after so much blood had been spilled? Who would you fight for, no matter the cost? Share your story in the comments. The sun rose clear over the Texas plains, casting soft gold across the land. The storm had passed, the gunfire silenced, but the aftermath lingered. The homestead stood battered yet upright, walls pocked with bullet holes, windows shattered, and blood soaking into the dirt outside. Birds returned to the sky, and cicadas hummed lazily in the warm morning air. The air smelled of blooming wildflowers and fresh earth, as if the land was trying to forget what it had witnessed. Sheriff Amos Tate arrived just past noon, his horse kicking up dust along the dry path. He dismounted slowly, surveying the damage. With a practiced eye, weathered and sunburned, his face held no judgment, only quiet understanding. He knew this land and what kind of man Silas Granger was. Clara met him at the gate, her shoulders squared, rifle slung over her back. Elias stood beside her, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Levi peeked from the porch, curious but silent. "Hell." "Of a night," Amos said, adjusting his hat. "You could say that," Clara replied, her voice steady but firm. Amos nodded, glancing at the broken porch rail and the blood-streaked dirt. "3 men down. That's going to stir things in town." "They came to kill us," Elias said, his voice low. "We had no choice." Amos met his gaze. "I'm not here to argue. I know who sent them, and I've had my fill of Silas Granger's schemes." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to Clara. "Your land's yours. The claim's official. There's nothing he can do about it, legally anyway." Clara took the paper, her fingers trembling just slightly. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of something solid. Proof. Her name. Her right. Not just survival, ownership. "But," Amos continued, glancing around again, "this won't stop him. He might send more. You need to be ready." "We will be," Elias said. The sheriff looked at Elias, studying the man who had once ridden into town with blood on his hands. Something in Elias had changed. Amos could see it in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or something stronger. Purpose. After the sheriff left, Elias saddled his horse and rode toward town. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above him, blue as a polished stone. Wildflowers lined the edge of the trail, waving gently in the wind. The ride was quiet, but Elias's thoughts churned with everything that had happened. There was no fear in him now, only a hard resolve. He reached Silas Granger's office just before sunset. The building was grander than needed, a false front, of power for a man who dealt in shadows. Elias stepped through the door without knocking. Silas sat behind his polished desk, fat fingers curled around a glass of whiskey. "Well," Silas said, setting the drink down. "Didn't expect you back. Thought maybe the woman would do you in." Elias didn't respond. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of coins, Silas's payment. He dropped it on the desk with a hollow thud. "No more blood for you," Elias said. Silas's smile vanished. His expression darkened. "You think this ends it? You walk in here and toss that back like you're righteous? You were mine the minute you took that money." Elias leaned in slightly, his voice cold. "Not anymore." Silas's hand twitched toward the drawer, but Elias turned away. "You try coming near that land again," he said without looking back, "and I'll bury you myself." Outside, the wind picked up, dust swirling around his boots as he mounted his horse. He rode out of town without a second glance, leaving behind the man who had nearly ruined him. Back at the homestead, the sky had turned a deep orange. Clara was patching the fence, her hair tied back and her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Elias dismounted and walked toward the cabin. Levi met him halfway, holding something behind his back. "I made this," the boy said, eyes shining with pride. He held out a small wooden carving, 3 figures standing side by side, a woman, a man, and a boy. The carving was roughly shaped, but unmistakable. Elias took it in his hand, staring at the tiny figures. He felt something move inside him, something fragile and unfamiliar. He looked down at Levi, then up at Clara, who watched in the doorway. Her expression softened. "He talks about you more than he ever did his real father," she said quietly. Elias's throat tightened. "I don't deserve that." Clara stepped closer. "Maybe not, but you're here. That counts." She briefly placed a hand on his arm, and for the first time she said his name. "Thank you, Elias." The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a soft glow that painted everything gold. The homestead stood quiet, still bruised but intact, a place rebuilt by pain, resilience, and stubborn refusal to give in. As the stars began to emerge, and the cicadas buzzed their endless chorus, Elias sat on the porch, the carving in his hand, the sounds of home around him. Had Elias finally found a home, or was danger still waiting? The sky blushed gold over the Texas plains, lighting the homestead warmly. The morning had never looked so peaceful. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh hay, mingling with the earthy sweetness of wild grass. The nearby creek rippled quietly, reflecting the sky like a pool of firelit glass. The land, once marked by scars and silence, now hummed with the promise of something new. A rider approached, cutting through the haze of sunrise. It was a courier from town, dust trailing behind his horse. Clara stepped onto the porch, Elias just behind her. The man handed her an envelope, tipped his hat, and hurried off. Clara opened it slowly, her hands steady. Inside, a land grant, official and final. Her name was printed in bold, undeniable letters. The fight was over. The land was hers. Elias looked at her as she read, the weight of months lifting from her face. For the first time she smiled without a trace of doubt. "It's done," she said. In town, the truth had caught up with Silas. Sheriff Amos made sure of it. Witnesses spoke, documents were reviewed, and the stories Silas spun unraveled in public. His grip on the region broke apart, and his influence withered with no hired guns left to shield him. The man who had once moved others like chess pieces now found himself alone. Elias stayed. There was no speech, no moment of decision. He remained as he belonged there all along. He helped mend what had been broken, rebuilding the barn, repairing the cabin, digging new posts for the fence. He didn't speak much about the past. It didn't need to be spoken. Levi followed him everywhere. They worked side by side, rode together, through the hills, and fed the animals each morning. Elias taught him to ride, starting slow, holding the reins over Levi's hands until the boy could guide the horse. Clara watched from the porch, a quiet pride settling in her chest. After the chores were done at night, they sat outside beneath the stars. The air was cool and the sky was endless above them. Sometimes Elias and Clara would share a blanket, sometimes just a glance. Words weren't needed. The silence between them had shifted from cautious to comforting. One night, Levi climbed into Elias's lap as the moon hung high and silver. His voice was small but sure. "Papa," he said, not by accident this time, not in fear, but with knowing. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He placed his hand gently on Levi's back and nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, "I'm here." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't forgetting, but it was something better. It was belonging. They talked about the future, not just survival, but growth. A new fence line, a second barn, maybe even a schoolhouse nearby. These are the dreams Elias had never allowed himself to have before. Now he shared them freely and even laughed once in a while. The land changed with the season. Grass grew tall and green. The creek ran clearer than ever. Birds returned to the trees, and the air no longer carried dread, but life. The cabin that once held tension now echoed with quiet joy. Elias stood one morning with Clara at his side, Levi tugging at his hand, and watched the sun rise again over the Texas plains. The sky was open and full of color. The wind carried no warning now, only peace. He had come to destroy a family, but found one instead. This family found hope against all odds. Subscribe and share to never miss a story of redemption. Comment below. What city and country are you listening from? We'd love to hear where this story reached you.